Before we get into this episode, I would like to make a quick disclaimer that all of Society Inspired's interviews and the information we share are 100% for learning experience and to hear the different sides of the various issues we discuss. We never endorse nor support violence, and we are committed to promoting peace. I want to create a safe space for learning and comfortable place for people to be able to start to speak. Hope you enjoy. I would like to preface this episode with a warning, as this episode contains mentions of harm reduction and drug use. Please keep this in mind as you listen and take caution of how you listen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 27th episode of Society Inspired. My name is Gemma. I'm 17 years old and a Palestinian American teen. I'm so excited to have Kota Babcock as our special guest for episode number 27. Would you like to introduce yourself, tell us your story, and also share your preferred pronouns, please?
Yes, I'm Kota Babcock. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And I currently live in Laramie, Wyoming. I am from Denver, which is where I started out as an LGBTQ and HIV activist. Um, I worked with children's hospitals, kind of offshoot program, All the Tea, for a few years. And that's really where I got my start. And now I work as the Director of Health Equity for Wyoming Equality. So I support the health department in developing kind of their LGBTQ inclusive language, doing HIV messaging, and a bunch of other things. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me. I'm also a trans man. I am a Jewish anti-Zionist, and yeah, I am really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, what inspired you to start your advocacy journey for the LGBTQ plus community?
So initially it was a lot of being bullied in middle school. I came out initially as a lesbian and I was pretty butch. I did a lot of sports in my middle school and was targeted in the locker room a decent amount of the time. So when I moved to the city, I came out in Castle Rock, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. It's a wealthier suburb, and I lived kind of over by the Section 8 housing also helped my case in not being bullied.
Yeah.
But after we moved back to the Denver area, I became really involved with the Center on Colfax and some local LGBTQ groups. And then my mentor there ended up moving on as they aged out and got really into HIV advocacy for young adults. So I joined them there and became really, really involved there, just because my mentor was already there and it was a topic I was already interested since I was really I had come from a school district where sexual health was like taught but not incredibly well.
Yeah.
So it was something I cared a lot about.
Awesome. Um, so as you mentioned, you do a lot in HIV advocacy spaces. Can you explain the HIV STD to our listeners who may not know much about the disease?
Yeah, HIV is a sexually transmitted infection that causes T cells, which are a type of white blood cell, to become basically reproduction factories for the virus. It targets the immune system because white blood cells are kind of our fighter cells. Um, and it makes it so that the body can't fight off infections. It's transmitted through breast milk, blood, vaginal fluids, semen. It is not transmitted through saliva or toilet seats or mosquito bites or anything like that. That's a really common misconception about it. You can share a drink with someone who has HIV. You can kiss someone who has HIV without any risk of
Yep.
getting the virus.
Well, can you explain the importance of HIV advocacy?
HIV advocacy is super important because it's deeply intertwined with disability advocacy as well as LGBTQ advocacy. Um, when AIDS was first found out about, it was a time when LGBTQ people were moving forward pretty progressively in terms of societal acceptance. We had elected multiple LGBTQ city and state officials. Massachusetts had their first LGBTQ governor at that point. California had elected Harvey Milk as city supervisor. And he'd been assassinated briefly before AIDS broke out in New York and San Francisco. Um, so it is in the background of like all of these great things happening for LGBTQ people that AIDS really like hits our community and hits it extremely hard. Young men in their 20s, sometimes in their teens, also, so sometimes young boys were dying of illnesses that babies wouldn't get and wouldn't die from. So it was like very simple cases of pneumonia that they just couldn't do anything about because these individuals had pretty much no immune system. Some of them developed Kaposi sarcoma, so a type of kind of skin cancer from it that would kind of mark all over their bodies, including internally. So it would be really painful. So in the face of that, a lot of AIDS activists were, or I guess LGBTQ activists first, who were becoming AIDS activists at this time, were panicking. There wasn't really any knowledge about how it spread for a long time. There was suspicion that it was sexually transmitted just because it was only impacting gay men visibly. Of course, we know that women, especially Black women, were heavily impacted by it, but were left out of death toll counts and left out of basically any information and holding any stakeholder power in the communications on AIDS and HIV. But in that first little round of the initial deaths, people were panicked. They were very stressed, and a lot of people were fighting to keep their jobs and houses when they visibly looked like they had AIDS. So it became a really, really important time for disability activism because all of a sudden, all of these newly disabled people who have AIDS were joining disability activism and fighting to keep their jobs, fighting for safety, and at the same time also fighting to get their partners covered under their life insurance plans, fighting to be able to see their partners in hospital when they weren't legally married. So it became kind of a huge turning point in our, not only in LGBTQ activism, because all of a sudden it wasn't just social equality we were fighting for, but also just like the right to exist and the right to be worth research and worth the scientific community's time. But also like it was a turning point for disability activism because all of a sudden there were these angry, dedicated people who had nothing to lose that were willing to join their efforts to the cause too. Um, so that's kind of the summary of how it started. And I think some of the key figures that are important to remember. So a lot of the key figures that we know today are going to be kind of wealthier white men, just because that's a lot of times who survived the longest. So keeping that in mind, Larry Kramer was a huge part of the movement. He was a wealthy former celebrity. He did screenwriting before the AIDS epidemic and was living off his royalties. He lived to be in his like late 70s. He died on my birthday in 2020. And so he was like a huge part of the movement and a huge force because he didn't have to worry about kind of the same things as everyone else. He had his finances covered, he had his housing covered. But in all of that, he also was able to create some really crucial and important memories and collective pieces of art. He made The Normal Heart. Another important piece of work that wasn't made by him is Angels in America. I always forget the name of the playwright there. Both of them are Jewish gay men writing about their experiences and loss. And I think that as a result, I think that loss ended up shaping a lot of how we understand gay relationships and same-sex relationships for a really, really long time. But yeah, that's kind of the very early aspect of HIV advocacy. But yeah, did I answer your question? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool.
What do you feel are the most urgent needs within the HIV communities, and how can we explain education / awareness around those needs?
So I think that the most urgent needs are basically like we need to fight criminalization. HIV criminalization goes against the Americans with Disabilities Act inherently, but tons of states have laws that will either penalize someone for having HIV essentially. So if you have sex with someone and you have HIV and they decide that they want to retaliate against you for any reason, they can just say that you didn't tell them because there's no way to prove that that's right or wrong. So that is like one of the most impactful pieces of of HIV criminalization legislation that exists. A lot of states have thankfully gotten rid of that one, but a more common one is criminalizing, adding like an extra few years to someone's sentence based on their HIV status. So in terms, this is common with sexual assault. It's common with sex work. And specifically, a lot of HIV advocates have tried to get it off of sex work related charges and done a little bit less effort on the sexual assault end of things, just because that one is more complicated, more emotionally like difficult to think about. But the general understanding of things is that you shouldn't be punished based on a health condition that you have, um, especially in the current day where HIV is very treatable. If you have HIV and you're on treatment for long enough and monitoring it long enough, you can actually become undetectable, which means that you can't spread it to anyone else through sex. And then additionally, we now live in a day and age where we have post-exposure medications that can basically prevent someone from getting HIV if taken within 72 hours.
Oh.
So the great thing about all of that is that it means that, for one, there's more support for victims of sexual assault. So we don't really need that initial crime to be as strong. Additionally, in like most survivors' experiences, it's so rare that your abuser is even going to catch a charge to begin with. So it's really a law that's there to penalize people with HIV rather than actually like positively influence the lives of victims. Additionally, in America, like HIV is still a death sentence for a lot of communities. If you are homeless or living unhoused in any way, whether that's couch surfing, living in your car, you may not have access to health insurance. And same with a lot of people who are housed. And if you don't have access to health insurance and you don't know how to get on Ryan White programs, which is HIV assistance funding, or your states met their limit, there is pretty much no way for you to get treated for HIV, which means that you will inevitably end up developing AIDS. We had, I think in Wyoming, we even had someone pass recently from AIDS related illness. And Wyoming has a lot more Ryan White funding than other states just because of our size. So getting additional support to communities that are less likely to have insurance, less likely to be able to get treated, that may have discomfort around going to doctor's offices, I think is extremely crucial. And we live in a day and age where HIV is just as preventable as pregnancy. PrEP exists. It's a daily pill that you can take to prevent HIV through sex. It also has limited efficacy in preventing it through needle sharing. So it's a safeguard. And the fact that a lot of communities don't even know about it is like a massive failing on our end as sexual health educators, as states in general, as leaders in our community. And I think it's just really crucial that we promote it to anyone who's sexually active. It especially makes me feel terrible when I find out about women who have HIV who didn't know it existed, because there's so many options that are not exclusive to preventing PrEP through anal sex. I think only one medication is limited to people assigned male at birth, and the rest have a slightly lower efficacy. But it's still like, I think it's still close to 80% efficacy if taken every day. So there's like all of these urgent needs within our communities where we can address HIV by preventing it, by supporting those most at risk, and just by learning about how it spreads. I think that we do a really huge disservice to people with HIV when we believe that it spreads by touching them or by hugging them. It's a very isolating illness just because of how stigmatized it is and how hard it is to talk about. And obviously, if you're a person with HIV trying to explain this to people, people might not believe you because they might just think, oh, you're so isolated that you're willing to do that. So by knowing the actual facts around HIV, I think that that's really like the greatest thing that we can do to support the HIV community is promoting educational campaigns on social media, by talking about it in our schools, by having conversations about what HIV is and who can get it. I think that even today, we still have this huge myth around only men who have sex with men end up with HIV, or only sex workers end up with HIV. And that is just like not the case at all. you can get HIV as a baby if your mother is breastfeeding you and gets HIV while in the breastfeeding and nursing process.
Yeah.
So I think that once we kind of are able to dispel a lot of rumors around these things and build awareness, we'll also be able to attract more funding to support communities more at risk. Hopefully, we'll be able to have more mutual aid available to fund people's medications, as they are one of the most price gouged medications that I've ever seen, I think. So I think that that is kind of the short answer, as long as it was,
Yeah.
of
Perfect.
weird diseases that we have. I think additionally, just a quick one is also like addressing the racism that exists within the medical institutions that prevents people from getting tested. The racism that exists not only in the testing world, but also in the gay community that prevents us from engaging, not us, but that prevents people from engaging more effectively. Because why would you walk into a space that's going to teach you about HIV if you know that you're going to be treated differently because of the color of your skin and your culture?
Yeah.
So
And branching off of that, how do we start conversations about HIV advocacy, and what sort of language should we use?
I think the easiest way to start conversations about it is by teaching essential sexual health in our schools.
Yeah.
And as adults, I think, and not even just as adults, but as anyone who's sexually active, um, having conversations with your partner about their testing status, I think brings up HIV in a kind of subtle and safe space. Because by talking about it, just like for your both your and your partner's safety, you're also like making it a present thing in their mind that they might think about and look up later.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to bring up a lot of conversations about HIV advocacy in today's day and age because so many school districts have made it pretty much impossible to talk about LGBTQ issues in schools, especially in the K through 12 or in the K through 8 system, which most people take their health classes kind of around the 6th to 8th grade
Yeah.
range. So I think it is really hard. I was really lucky that I got to learn about HIV in history classes. And I think that history teachers in either secondary or post-secondary have a great opportunity to start those conversations. I think podcasters have a really good opportunity to do it. I became a journalist initially because so much reporting on HIV was so completely incorrect. And I had a big, huge passion for correcting narratives. And I think that I still do, just in kind of a different route of things now, where it's more coming from nonprofits, coming directly from people living with HIV and LGBTQ people. But I think that anyone can really start a conversation about HIV advocacy. It's really important, I think, to avoid stigmatizing language. When I ask people about their status, I never ask, "Are you clean?" because I don't think that people with HIV are dirty inherently.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I ask people just like, when was the last time you got tested? What were your results? Another thing that's a really common terminology is status, but I think that that one is a little bit more not everyone's going to know what that means right away. So I think that just asking people their habits is a really good way to start that conversation. Making sure that people also don't feel like they are medicalized. So I don't refer to people living with HIV as AIDS patients. While I am disabled and I identify as a disabled person, not every disability is the same. And I personally use I use identity first language. So I say I'm a disabled person, an autistic person, a crutch user. But for people living with HIV, since it's not usually a condition you're born with, it's not usually something that has shaped your identity for your whole life. It's something that kind of happens to you. It's really common to use the terminology people living with HIV. Something that's also fine to use is HIV positive. For couples that are of differing statuses, there's also a term called magnetic couples, which I think is really cute.
Oh,
That it just is like the opposites attract kind of energy, and I love it. It's a little bit less commonly used, but I think just making people feel safe and like they're valued through your language is the most important thing that you can do in including people living with HIV and making sure that your advocacy is Um,
I love the animals.
yeah, I have a bunch of them, and like they usually chill, but not today. Um, yeah. I'm trying to think of anything else with language, but I think that that kind of covers it.
Yeah, no, I started homeschooling in 8th grade, but I was in middle school, a private middle school. Um, and I remember there was no um sex education class other than like our teacher telling us that like abortion was wrong. Um, and then the only other thing was someone asked about HIV because we were talking about Queen. We were talking about Freddie Mercury. And I remember our teacher just completely like freaking out, being like, you have to go home and ask your parents that. I can't imagine like, because I knew, and my mom made sure nothing was hidden from me. Like, because there's no point in hiding anything from my kid. They're going to find out at some point. And I just can't imagine what that reaction did to that kid because they probably didn't want to ask anymore. They probably thought it was something bad, something weird. And so there was no education at that school I went to about health in general, but let alone healthcare. Definitely think education in schools is such an important thing that is continuously being taken away in this.
Yeah.
What are some ways we can support and join advocacy for the HIV community?
So I think that HIV advocacy is getting a little bit smaller, just because we're a lot of the time merging with harm reduction organizations. I personally volunteer with a harm reduction organization locally because it's what's available. And it's, a lot of the time, it's more of the on the ground work to prevent HIV and to provide immediate resources to people living with HIV. Harm reduction is kind of what it sounds like, but harm reduction, capital H and capital R, is focused on drug user health and sexual health. So a lot of the times those areas are combined because a lot of people who are using drugs may end up doing sex work at some point or another. So those resources need to be available. Additionally, if they end up even having sex that is like between them and their partner, they might not be thinking about production as much, despite the fact that either they or their partner might be sharing needles. So by having them kind of combined into this topic, it really helps to make sure that people are protecting themselves and supporting their partners and friends as strongly as possible. But harm reduction is kind of a name for a lot of different things that all revolve around keeping people alive, preventing viruses, and treating people who do end up with conditions such as hepatitis or HIV. A lot of the times this is through needle exchanges. I personally live in a state where needle exchanges are explicitly outlawed. But it also is about distributing naloxone for overdose prevention, promoting PrEP for HIV prevention, offering testing, kind of just like this big, huge list of things. Condoms are very common in it, providing cotton swabs and sterile water for people who are injecting or taking drugs in other routes that might involve the need to mix powder with water. But I think that really harm reduction has taken over a lot of where youth HIV activism and adult HIV activism used to really thrive. And I think that that's a positive change because it means that, for one, we're more in our communities. A lot of the times, I know that my organization didn't have like our own physical location. And a lot of harm reduction organizations either have access to a physical location or operate through kind of counseling offices, rehab centers, public health offices. So thankfully, it means that like there's a place to put these supplies. There's a place that people can go directly to a lot of the time for these resources. Of course, it is sad because it means that people living with HIV that might otherwise just be able to go to a peer group there and know that everyone around them knows about HIV and is very educated on it. They do have to go to a space where that might not necessarily be the case, and that is sad, I think. But I think that the net outcome is really positive, that it's shifting more to harm reduction. I think that that also kind of centers the fact that HIV has become more preventable, more treatable, and that the stigma is going down a lot with the U equals U campaign, which is the undetectable equals untransmittable through the CDC. I think that we're just in an era where I think we're exceptionally close to curing HIV. It's been cured in a handful of people globally. We are exceptionally close to having like an answer to stigma. I think that it's really hard to get rid of stigma completely, especially in rural areas where we are a little bit behind on a lot of our understandings. I think I like to tell people in Denver that Wyoming sometimes feels like it's 2 or 3 decades behind in some things, which isn't always bad. I think that in terms of like traffic, it's great. I do not feel like I'm living with in a population that matches 2024 when I'm driving in traffic, because
Yeah.
usually traffic is like 15 minutes from my house to downtown or something.
Yeah.
And in Denver, it would be like an hour to get across in the same town.
I'm
So
in
it's not
LA,
always a bad
so
thing.
I get
And
traffic.
also, like, it's especially not a bad thing in terms of our HIV funding because we do have more ability to get people on Ryan White, whereas New York, because they've promoted HIV testing so much, because there's such a large area, might not have that immediate resource for folks that they can offer upon testing positive. Um, so I like to say that and then also clarify that I don't mean that in like Wyoming is always going back socially. I do think that Wyoming is really struggling to empower people with disabilities in general and really struggling to empower LGBTQ people, especially in the last few years in legislative efforts. But overall, I think that rural communities are still a part of the movement for HIV advocacy. And I think that if you want to join advocacy, something really crucial you can do is sign up for newsletters so that you can learn first. I think that sometimes people want to throw themselves directly into a cause, and that is a great energy to have. However, I think that a lot of spaces will educate you and a lot of them will not know how to do that. So taking that step yourself can be really, really important. Some organizations that I really like looking at educational materials from are like the Positive Women's Network, which does a lot with stigma work. It does a lot with dispelling stereotypes about HIV since it is entirely led by women who are often not talked about in HIV topics. I also really like Advocates for Youth. I worked with them a few years ago as one of their ambassadors for National Youth HIV and AIDS Awareness Day. Um, and of course, you can learn about just like the generals of HIV from UNICEF. Um, the National AIDS Grove in San Francisco has quite a bit that you can kind of look through in terms of history. I think that watching fictional accounts and engaging with plays and literature is super important too. I think my favorite play is probably still The Normal Heart, which I mentioned earlier. Angels in America is also gorgeous and it has an HBO series. So if you don't feel like reading it, super easy. You can just go watch this mini series. It's like 2 or 3 episodes. I'm trying to think of more books, but in harm reduction, there is a really crucial book written by a woman who used drugs, I believe. I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called. It's called Saving Our Own Lives. There we go. It's by Shira Hassan, and it's kind of a very introductory approach to harm reduction, and it's really about allowing people in specific circumstances to make their own narratives and not to make them for them. It's about empowering people who use drugs, people living with HIV, people engaging in sex work to have the initiative and have the empowerment to make their own healthcare decisions. And especially about doing things when you might not have the resources to do them right. And that's in quotes. I don't know if people can see me doing that,
Yeah,
but
on Spotify, they only do the video episodes now, so they will see you doing that. And then YouTube will also see
cool. Yeah.
you.
But yeah, saving our own lives is easily one of the most important approaches to harm reduction, like one of the most important books approaching harm reduction. Um, and I think that it's really important when approaching HIV activism and when approaching LGBTQ activism that you do understand a lot of the history. I think that that's kind of been my generation's failing in walking into LGBTQ advocacy, is being like, why is everything so sex centered? Why is everything blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
And a lot of the times, like that is because places for LGBTQ people, a lot of the time we're also the only place that they could express that. Respecting that and also choosing to walk away if it's not your thing is totally fine. But making sure that you understand the history is really crucial into walking into these spaces. Understanding that identity is such as like bear or leather daddy are not explicitly sexual. They
Wow.
also are about a shared community of people who dress and look a certain way, being welcomed. So yeah, the best way that you can support in things is by learning about them, donating to good causes such as the National AIDS Grove, donating to organizations that center Black people living with HIV, just because Black men are often heavily targeted by the medical system as being kind of like they almost treat Black men who have sex with men like patient zero, essentially. Like it's always about going to that community to do prevention first, which I do think is important, but the way that it's phrased is extremely stigmatizing.
Yeah.
So if you can support organizations that not only are directly impacted by HIV in general, but also by the harm of the medical system at times, I think that that is a really, really important part of the work. I also think that if you want to look more into medical organizations that are doing a really great job, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center has a pretty good history with HIV. They have, I believe that one of the folks I've met who works there is a Black man living with HIV, which sometimes you just do not see in a lot of the higher end, like more well-funded medical groups. So it's super important, I think, to support organizations that are putting those people in leadership positions, making
Mhm.
sure that they're heard, and sending them for presentations with huge organizations and state agencies. So I think, yeah. And if you want to join, of course, learn first, and then, of course, volunteer. I think that unfortunately, HIV advocacy, especially involving youth or people who are technically doing things that are against the law, a lot of the time cannot have bank accounts, cannot get funding. So paying staff is really hard, and maintaining volunteers can be more difficult in certain populations. So if you're outside of that population and really want to be an ally, I think donating your time is the best thing that you can do. And a lot of the time, anything that you can't learn online, you can absolutely learn from people on the ground. And if there's anything you're ever nervous about, I think it never hurts to safely ask someone like first, of course, are you comfortable with me asking a question about this, this, and this? And then asking it and then being like, I hope this doesn't come off as offensive. Just
Yeah.
making it very clear that you're there to support them rather than kind of interrogating them for your own benefit exclusively.
Yeah.
I think that that's sometimes a mistake that activists make, is just walking in and like kind of just like jumping in and doing everything on their own
Yeah.
behalf rather than on the behalf of the people that they're helping and the people that they want to work with. So centering the people that you actually are dedicated to in how you ask questions is one of the more important parts of getting involved, I think.
So I think you just also answered the resource question. Um, so that's great. I will link all of those below the episode
Awesome.
in the description. I always struggle with that word. I can never remember what it is. And then lastly, where can my followers find you on social media so they can keep up with you and see what is next for you?
Yeah, I'm a little bit absent on social media, I will admit. I am more of a lurker than a poster, but my at on most things is at Kota Babcock, KOTABABCOCK. I am on X reluctantly still. I just honestly forget to delete my account. Um, but if you want to kind of look through kind of the things I've done in the past, it's all there. I am slightly more on Instagram. Sometimes it's just me posting my dog, though. I will warn you. I think one of the organizations that I work with right now is Wyoming Harm Reduction, and I will pull up that Instagram if I can find it. Yeah, so that Instagram for the one that I currently work with is at YOWYO Harm Reduction, HARMREDUCTION. And I work with them, and I plan on working with them even when I leave Wyoming to some extent. So if you want to see kind of the work I've done recently, the work that I care about in rural communities, and especially for people living with HIV in rural communities. It's all there. If you want to support the work directly that they are doing, they're also selling T-shirts on Redbubble, as well as stickers, buttons, etc. And Wyoming Harm Reduction Collective is primarily run by people who have lived experience using drugs, lived experience with HIV. I personally, my high school boyfriend was diagnosed, which wasn't the reason I got into it initially, but I found out kind of after we broke up and while I was still involved with it, and it was a lot of the reason that I got more involved.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if you want to find an organization that doesn't have a ton of support and just like lend anything to them, we will absolutely accept it. Finding volunteers is a challenge in rural spaces. Finding volunteers with lived experience is a challenge. So yeah, that's my little bit of my
Yeah.
social media.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this interview. Make sure you follow Kota on social media platforms and support their journey. And make sure to follow our other social media platforms as well so you don't miss out on more interviews and important information. I hope you guys enjoyed the 27th episode of Society Inspired, and we will see you guys next time.